Well, it was a tight race, but with 27% of the votes, Waterborne HVLP was the viewer's choice for the wall-hanging tool chest. So let's jump right into the world of Waterborne finishes. Now, I can't go too far without mentioning some of the chemistry behind this stuff. The truth is, water-based is actually a bit of a misnomer. The correct term would be waterborne. Water-based would indicate that the cured material can be reactivated with water, a lot like those little trays of paints that we used to play with as kids. Obviously, that wouldn't make a very good finish. Now, grossly simplified, waterborne finishes utilize a very special class of solvents known as glycol ethers. We discussed this earlier in the year in that guild favorite, You and I. Now, another example that really has nothing to do with dyes, but you might find interesting, involves waterborne finishes. Now, polyurethane and acrylic resins don't dissolve in water, but they do dissolve in glycol ethers. And the glycol ethers can then be put into a water solution, and the water serves as a carrier. That's why the term is waterborne. So remember that just because it's waterborne doesn't mean that it's solvent-free. You still need to protect yourself. You know what? I think we need a visual aid. So let's pretend that this alcohol-soluble dye is an acrylic resin. And we know that this is not going to go into water, because it just doesn't dissolve in water. So pour a little water in there and you can see what happens. It just beads up. But now let's add a little bit of alcohol to the mix. And you can see immediately the dye starts to go into solution. Okay, so let's mix it up a little bit. And now the amazing thing here, and this is how the water-based finishes work, now that that dye is in the alcohol solution, the alcohol is water soluble, and you can add water and dilute it out. Now, you don't want to add too much water because, you could sort of create a wacky, slurry solution. But the bottom line is you can tolerate a little bit of water, and that's how the water-based finishes work. Basically, the glycol ether dissolves the acrylic, and then that mixture is carried in a solution of water. So essentially, the finish goes down on the surface, the water evaporates, and then the glycol ether solvent evaporates, and the resin molecules can sort of become fused together at that point, and the finish is locked down to the surface. Now today we're going to be using one of my favorites. It's General Finishes High Performance. Now what I like about this finish so much is the fact that it's not just an acrylic resin. It's actually a hybrid of acrylic and polyurethane resin, so it's incredibly durable. So if you're not familiar with waterborne finishes, this is a really good place to start for any interior project inside the house. And for shop furniture, maybe it's a little bit overkill, but it's a great finish for just about any interior wood application. So the first thing we need to do is pre-raise the grain. And I'm going to kill a few birds with one stone here. I'm going to actually load up the gun just with water. First of all, the gun needs to be flushed out. It hasn't been used in a little while, so if I have to flush it out with water anyway, I may as well be spraying that water on my project. The water gets on the project and the grain gets pre-raised. Now real quick, with pre-raising the grain, if you've never heard of this term before, it's just a way to prevent the grain from raising when we apply the finish to it. You see, when water gets on the surface, the wood fibers swell up, little cut-off wood fibers all of a sudden stand up straight in the surface that you just sanded to 220, all of a sudden feels extremely rough. So it really only does this once though. So you could spray it with water, sand it back down once it dries, and then put your finish and you'll get a nice smooth finish. The other thing we're going to do is spray the piece and sort of just work out our spray strategy. We're going to get the fan to look right as we're spraying. We're going to get the amount of fluid to be set right. Now you make a final adjustment when the actual finish is in the gun because the finish sprays differently than just plain water. But you can kind of get practice and get some strategy down. Now when you're spraying with a water-based finish, I recommend either maybe a 1.5 millimeter tip. Today we're going to go with 1.5 millimeter. What I've got in my gun is 2. And I'm just going to show you how I change the needle and the tip so you can kind of see how that process is done. Now here's the tip, here's the needle, and they're always in pairs. They're sized appropriately so that the needle goes right through the tip and blocks off the hole just perfectly. So most guns are designed pretty much the same. If you've taken one apart, you've taken them all apart. Okay. To use this little tool to pull the tip out. Now incidentally, if you have the luxury, first of all, of having a spray system, And then the luxury beyond that of having multiple guns, it's a really good idea to dedicate guns to a particular type of finish. So water-based finishes, for instance, I like to keep those in one particular gun and never use that gun for anything but water-based materials. Okay, so you just take the screw out of the back, there's a little spring, and now I can pull my needle out, take the new needle, push that all the way in until it comes out the front here. Spring goes back on. This guy, just push the spring down and turn, which sometimes is a little tricky to do. Okay. And we need a tip, 1.5 tip. Tighten. And these usually have a little tooth on it that goes into a recess, so you can only put it on one way. And screw the ring on. And real quick, gun anatomy, this guy on the front is going to change the direction of the fan. Okay, sometimes you want it horizontal, sometimes you want it vertical. And on this gun, there's really only one other adjustment, and that's on the back. This adjustment is how far it opens up the line, basically how much fluid it's letting in. So this is your fluid control. Some guns also have a air volume control, but obviously that's not 100% necessary. So before we start making all kinds of noise here, let me show you some of the different approaches I'm going to take to handle different challenges for a shape like this. Now, anytime you're on the inside of a case, it's just tricky. You get a lot of bounce back and a lot of, fine dust, mist is going to form from the finish and drop onto the surface. You just do the best you can. My strategy, though, is essentially to do overlapping passes as I go through. And here's another key thing. Whenever you're using a spray gun, you want to be careful to just kind of think of your wrist as being locked. You really don't want to rotate your wrist this way or that because you wind up getting uneven finish. So try and think of your arm almost as a mechanical part of your body. So as you're going across this way, the approach and the distance and the angle from the nozzle to the surface is the same the whole time. Okay, so you want overlapping passes as you go. Once I get to the corner, I'm not going to attack the corner dead on this way. I'm actually going to take the back panel and then try to take the side panel separately, and that seems to reduce a lot of the bounce back that you might otherwise get. Also, if you do have air control, it's not a bad idea to turn it down a little bit on the inside of the case so you're not blowing extra finish everywhere. On large flat surfaces, it's actually very easy, again, keeping your gun 90 degrees to the surface, take nice long smooth passes. One big thing, whenever you're spraying, you always want to continue to hold that trigger even after you've gone off the workpiece. Do not stop right at the end of the workpiece. You just won't get even finish. You tend to lose a little bit at the end. So hold it in and then let go once you're off of it and then start back on your path. That's pretty much it for the most part. The only other thing I'll mention is we talked about inside corners. Your approach for outside corners, I like to think of it as taking that corner and cutting my fan in half. That is one case where I do want to attack it directly, and that helps me get a little bit more even flow over that corner. And what I'll do is sort of handle all of the edges first. I'll go around and do all the edges, and then I'll come over and then work on the top. Essentially, I like to make my most important surfaces the last surfaces I touch in a situation like this. So let me turn on the turbine. We will start spraying some water. I won't be very careful with the water, but I will perfect my flow and things like that before I put my real finish in. So the first thing I like to do is pull the trigger, see what we're getting out of it. It's a pretty heavy spray, so I'm going to lighten up a little bit on the fluid. To decrease the fluid, I tighten the control here. It's a very, very fine mist now. Okay, and what I'm looking for is basically, I don't know, maybe a 6 to 8 inch fan when I'm 6 to 8 inches away from the workpiece. All right, so now I'm just gonna let this dry for about an hour. We'll come back, sand everything down nice and smooth, and then we can start applying the real finish. So it's been about 45 minutes. Everything is pretty dry. And I'm gonna come back with some 320 grit paper and just lightly scuff sand by hand and smooth everything out. It'll make it a nice, clean, smooth surface for our finish. All right, so I'm just gonna make sure that we're mixed well. I've got a semi-gloss here, so there will be some flatteners that you're gonna wanna mix. And I'll be honest, I don't usually wear a respirator at this stage of the game. I don't find that the fumes are significant enough to really be much of an issue. But as soon as I atomize this stuff by spraying, forget about it. You definitely want to protect yourself from that. And what I've got here is a standard paint filter. It's always a good idea to filter your finishes before spraying. All those little tiny pieces of crud, dirt, whatever, stuff from my little stir stick can really screw up the finish if it gets through. Just let that pour all the way in. I don't usually find that I need to dilute this at all, but if you do, if you're having trouble working with it, you're not getting enough of a nice flow, it's not self-leveling the way you expect it to, you can go up to maybe 10-20% with water, but you don't really want to go too far beyond that. I've never really had a need to go beyond 10%, even in the hottest points in my summer here in Arizona, so, but no more than 20%. After about an hour, I'm going to start sanding the surface with some 400 grit. And the hard stuff to get, I usually go by hand, but on the big wide surfaces, I like to use a sanding block. And that just kind of ensures that the surface stays as flat as possible, giving you the smoothest finish possible. And before applying the next coat, I make sure that if there's any dried finish on the tip, I just use my fingernail to scrape that off. And I give it a good shake, make sure it's nice and well mixed. So it's getting a little bit late in the day. Unfortunately, I started a little bit later than I normally would have. So I got about 3 coats in. Now tomorrow, I'm gonna put on my 4th and final coat. And just to give you an idea, I've gone through an entire can of finish at this point. So tomorrow, I'll probably just take off the top quarter of another can and then I'll be done. Overnight, I am not gonna just leave the gun alone. That water-based finish is going to dry inside there and that's gonna create some problems for you. So make sure you get a nice full thing of hot water. Maybe even put a little bit of, very little bit of soap. You can run some soapy water, but just make sure you rinse it thoroughly several times. But I'm just gonna run some regular water, no soap, warm water through this and run a whole can's worth just to make sure I clean out all the parts, and that's all I'm gonna do before tomorrow. So now everything's gonna get a light 600 grit sanding, and really at this point for the final coat, I'm only concerned with my outside show faces. Pretty much done with the interior. It's a little roughness here and there, but I'm not too worried about it. It's the inside of this cabinet. It's really the outside show surfaces that I'm going to be the most concerned with, and we can buff everything up a little bit later on in the shop. But for now, sand it lightly, and we'll be ready for the last coat. So now I've got the tool chest in the shop and I can get a really good close look at the way the finish turned out. And honestly, I couldn't be more happy with it. The Earlex unit sprays beautifully. It's just a nice, continuous, smooth, semi-gloss surface, and that's really all I can ask out of a water-based finish. I'm really happy with the results. Now, there are a few things that I wanted to talk about. First of all, much like my oil-based finishes, if there's any little nibs or anything in the finish, especially since we did spray outside, it's not a bad idea to get a nice high grit soft pad. This is just a sanding pad from a Festool sander, 2000 grit. And any place I feel a little bit of roughness, I'll come back and just hit it very lightly with this. You don't want to go too hard because we don't want to really scuff the surface or burnish the surface at all. The good thing though is this water-based finish dries so fast that even though we sprayed outside, I have less nibs in this than I usually have in an oil-based finish applied by hand in my shop. It just takes so long to dry, more things are bound to settle into it. So spraying outside, it's not the ideal, right? Obviously, if you could spray inside with some sort of a homemade spray booth, that's the way to go. But like you guys, I don't really have the right setup for it right now. Maybe I'll build one someday, but for now, setting up the sawhorses and spraying in the backyard, to me, is the best way to do it. And like I said, the results just aren't too bad. Maybe if it's a really windy day, you wait till the next day to do your spraying. Now, overall, we talked about lifeless look to a water-based finish. This looks pretty decent, but it's on Baltic birch. It's not really a wood that's known for being extremely beautiful to begin with. So some people may not like that creamy, white, plain sort of look to it. So what I did as an experiment, just because I had extra shelf material here, I decided to take one of the shelves, finish it normal, just with the plain water-based finish, and then this one was hit with a coat of boiled linseed oil first. Basically soak it in linseed oil for about an hour, well, flood it on the surface, don't dip it in. Put the linseed oil on the surface, let it soak in for an hour, wipe off the excess, and then I gave it 4 or 5 days to dry before I applied the water-based finish. And you can see there's a dramatic difference in the look of these two boards. This looks like it may have been hit with some sort of oil. This clearly looks like it was hit with water-based finish. So, definitely something to consider when you're doing a project like this. If you like the look of those oil-based finishes, don't be afraid to hit it with a little bit of boiled linseed oil first, because it will give it a distinctly more amber color. So that, my friends, is water-based finish with HVLP. I know it's really difficult to see what we did. Some of the action is a little bit hard to catch on video. The other problem is you put the camera too close while you're spraying and you wind up with a whole bunch of overspray on the lens for the camera. So there's some difficulty in getting this stuff captured for you on video. But hopefully I was able to give you enough pointers that you might feel comfortable jumping into this yourself. So of course, thanks for watching. Thanks for being guild members, and we'll catch you next time.